Welcome to the Heritage Toronto iTour of the Toronto Island. You should be listening to this at the ferry dock at the foot of Bay Street, and you should have printed from our website the map of the route for easy reference as you go. We've marked the stops on the map with numbers, which we'll refer to in the tour so you can check that you're in the right place. As with all our iTours, this one is designed to be paused while you travel between stops. At the end of each stop, we'll give you clear instructions on how to get to the next point. You can then press pause and start up again when you reach the next stop on the tour. If the Hanlan's Point ferry is already here, then hop on it and listen to the introduction on the way over. If not, then you can listen to it while you're waiting. Today we're going to guide you around the Toronto Island. You'll take the Hanlan's Point ferry and then bike or walk across the island all the way to Ward's Island Ferry Dock, where you can catch a ferry for the return trip. Along the way, we're going to talk about the history of the island and why it has been an important place since long before the city of Toronto was created in 1834. But first, we're going to hear from Jennifer Torrey, Regional President of RBC. RBC Foundation is a generous supporter of Heritage Toronto's iTour program.
Thank you for joining us today on this excursion to explore Toronto's heritage. From the time we opened our very first branch in 1903 on the corner of Yonge and Wellington, RBC Royal Bank's journey has been one of partnering with other prominent city builders to help create this strong and diverse metropolis. RBC, our clients, and our employees share a deep affection for this great city. We take pride in our long and continuing chapter in Toronto's story, from building new branches to building careers to building communities through our countless philanthropic activities that enrich our city, like being the biggest corporate supporter of United Way, helping organizations welcome newcomers to Canada, as well as sponsoring these podcasts to share our strong shared history. Whether you're new in town or a local like me who is seeing the city through new eyes, I hope you enjoy taking in the sights and sounds of Toronto, past and present. I invite you to let your imaginations run wild as we step back through time to discover our diverse history and hear the tales of this vibrant city. Finally, as you wander through our neighborhoods, keep an eye out on every street corner for an RBC footprint. From the interesting architectural styles spanning the decades showcased in our local branches, to the famous gold Royal Bank Plaza towers on Bay Street, to community events like the Toronto Film Festival, Winter City, and RBC Daisy Fest. RBC is truly privileged to be part of the local landscape and to help tell Toronto's stories today. We look forward to helping create many more tales and working together to build this great city. I hope you enjoy your tour.
Toronto Island has long been a place where Torontonians have gone to relax and have fun. Back in the 1790s, Elizabeth Simcoe, wife of the first Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe, loved to ride over here and referred to it as my favorite sands. Back then, even though it was called the island, it was actually a peninsula, a long sandbar connected to the mainland at the foot of present-day Woodbine Avenue and curved around to form the harbor. It was this harbor that encouraged Simcoe to locate the town of York, as he named Toronto, here. It was only in 1858 that a severe storm washed out part of the peninsula at the east end of the bay and created what we now call the Eastern Gap, a modern entrance for shipping from the east. Without a link to the mainland, the peninsula became an island. Our tour starts at Hanlan's Point, but before we start the tour, we're going to hear a little bit about the history and the culture of Toronto Island. We'll hear first from two island residents, actor Matthew Ferguson and writer Alison Zowski. The actual tour starts after we have a conversation with them. You can listen to their thoughts about the island during the ferry ride over, or while you're waiting for the ferry. When we reach the dock, please head over to the statue of Ned Hanlan, which is directly ahead of the ferry dock. Then, turn the tour back on. First, our conversation with Alison and Matthew.
Hi, I'm Matt Ferguson. I was born on the island in 1973, and I've lived here on and off for my whole life.
Hi, I'm Alison Zowski, and I came to the island in the early 60s with my family, where we lived here for summers, and then I lived here year-round until, I guess, the early 80s, and then I went to the city for a while, and I came back a year and a half ago.
When you refer to the island to city people, they often say, oh, you mean Center Island, which is actually only one of 13 islands that exist here. Does that sound right, Allison?
Well, now that you've counted them out, yeah. Because I know that we were joined to the city, right?
That's right.
And then it was about 150 years ago during a storm that we blew apart.
That's right.
And so we've been an island since then.
And the islands, or what was the peninsula, are formed from the Scarborough Bluffs, and the sand that falls off the Scarborough Bluffs, the current brings it this way, and that's what formed the islands originally.
It's a community in one of the truest senses. I mean, in terms of us being close to each other, but also you get a great range of people here.
The strong sense of community that's here, that was partly created through our struggle to exist, through our struggle to hold on to our homes and our community. We're aware of the power of advocacy. We're aware of the ability to change thoughts and minds, whether that's through arts or politics.
So Ward's Island started as a tent community. It was summer residences at the very beginning, and people lived in came over for the summer and would pitch their tents. And then, as I understood it, the tents would blow down in big storms, so they started building wooden platforms, and those were the beginnings of what became the houses over on Ward's Island, which are now year-round residences.
After the Second World War, a lot of people were encouraged by the government to move here and build houses because there was a housing crisis in Toronto. And so there were 5,000 residents at its peak in the 1950s. And then when jurisdiction of the island transferred from Toronto to the newly formed Metro Council, contrary to a promise Metro had made, they began bulldozing houses in 1956 and continued for more than a decade and wiped out a large percentage of the community. Not only homes, but stores, hotels, bowling alley, dance hall.
Because they started tearing down from that end, and they were coming this way when these two islands, Wards and Algonquin, got together and decided to fight.
If they had wanted to really get rid of the whole community, they should have started on this end, because this was historically the poorer end of the island. So the houses that they began bulldozing at Centre and Hanlan's, a lot of these families had other options. They had other places they could move. And they were also offered compensation for their homes. Whereas by the late 60s, by the time the bulldozer had reached this part of the island, all the residents here had nothing to lose by fighting and everything to gain, because a lot of these residents, including myself and my family, really had nowhere else to go. Prior to the 70s, a landlord could evict a tenant for almost anything. But new laws had come into place whereby a landlord had to have a reason to evict a tenant. And this was the fight that the island community brought all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, where we lost. But we still refused to give up. So by 1980, Metro had armed the sheriff with eviction notices that he was coming to serve to the community. And throughout that year, and for even a few years prior, we'd been training in ways to obstruct the service of these notices. As a kid growing up here, I remember being constantly on the lookout for the sheriff. This is just something we had to do. Because he was the guy who was going to come and serve these notices of eviction.
Because I can remember they had us training where a pretend sheriff, an actor would come and knock on your door, and we had to stand outside the house and not let him in without.
You have to lock arms like this.
Yeah, and not let them, and not become physical or aggressive, but not let him in near your house.
Right, or lie down. It came to a head here on July 28th, 1980, when we got word that the sheriff would be coming today. So when word came, the sheriff's on his way, the siren went off, the telephone tree went into effect, residents came back to the island any way they could, and met here at the foot of the bridge. The community gathered and made a human barrier preventing him from passing.
We all were down here we were linking arms there, I think, too, and we were singing
Yep.
We Shall Not Be Moved for a while, and then he arrived. Right. And then Liz spoke to him.
Liz Amer, whose duty it was to speak to the sheriff on the day of the bridge. And the sheriff asked Liz to speak on behalf of the community and say, is your intention to obstruct the service of these notice today? And Liz said, well, I think obstruct is kind of a harsh word. What I would say is we're not prepared to cooperate in any way.
And if you're in the crowd, you couldn't hear what was going on, so none of us really knew until he turned around and drove back the way he'd come, and then she got up on a ladder and told us what had happened.
I look back on that moment and I just admire her for the presence of mind to speak so well on behalf of all of us, you know, and to simply say that we're not prepared to cooperate. A very powerful statement.
Okay, we're ready to begin the iTour of Toronto Island. Remember, when you exit the ferry, head for the Ned Hanlan statue, a bronze buff guy with an oar. He'll be right ahead of you. This is stop 1 on your map. You're now standing next to a Toronto legend. Handsome, isn't he? It's hard to overstate what a legend Ned Hanlan was back in his time. He was born in July 1855. His father, John, was a fisherman and later became the island constable and a hotel keeper on the island. The Hanlans originally lived at the Ward's End of Toronto Island, the east end where our tour will finish, but a severe storm in 1865 pushed their little house into the harbor. The story then goes that the family put the house on a raft and then sailed it along the shore to the north end of Gibraltar Point, a little further along our route from here. A few years later, Ned's father built a small hotel on this part of the island, and the area became known as Hanlan's Point. The family played an important role in the development of this part of the island into a major holiday destination. Every day, young Ned used to row several kilometers across the harbor to go to and from George Street Public School on the mainland. He got stronger and faster, and by the time he was 14, he was competing in local rowing events. He turned pro 2 years later and was quickly winning every race he entered. Part of his success was due to his mastery of the new sliding seat that had been invented in England. This allowed rowers to generate more power in their stroke by using their legs. In 1877, he became Canadian champion, and in 1878, he claimed the U.S. rowing championship as well. In 1879, Ned conquered England. He returned to Toronto as an international sports hero with the English Rowing Championship. On his way back, the victorious Hanlan celebrated at Madison Square Garden in New York. As his ferry approached Toronto, he was greeted by thousands of Torontonians who lined the shore, their cheers rushing over the waves and mingling with the sounds of brass bands. Long before our modern hockey or baseball stars, Toronto had its first cherished sports celebrity. Hanlan was world champion for 5 straight years and ultimately lost only 6 of 300 races in his career. All this in a pretty small frame. He was only 1.7 meters tall and weighed 68 kilos. When Ned retired, he followed his father into the hotel business and entered politics, becoming a Toronto alderman. He died at the young age of 52 in 1908, a victim of pneumonia. Up to 10,000 Torontonians paid their respects to their hero as they filed past his body, lying in state at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church at King and Simcoe Streets. Ned Hanlan had helped Toronto, an upstart city at the edge of the empire, feel proud. Our next stop will be by the island airport. Pause the tour and walk a little further over to your right, past the blue and gold province of Ontario Ned Hanlan plaque, and over to the 2 black and gold Heritage Toronto plaques. Stop there and restart the tour. You're now at stop 2 and standing in front of 2 Heritage Toronto plaques commemorating Babe Ruth and baseball on Toronto Island. The earliest sports on the island were hunting and fishing. Pigeons, ducks, and geese were abundant. In winter, curling, skating, and ice boating were popular, while in the summer there was sailing, rowing, canoeing, swimming, cycling, and horse racing. The first hotel was built on the island in 1833. Many others followed over the years, including those operated near here by Ned Hanlan and his father. Later came dancing, bowling alleys, amusement parks, and even a small zoo. Here at Hanlan's Point, the first summer cottage was built in the early 1870s, and a camping area was established in the 1880s. In 1894, the Toronto Ferry Company created more land by dredging up silt from the bottom of the harbor and piling it up on the sandy edges of the shore. On top of the new land, they built the Hanlan's Point Amusement Park, Toronto's version of Canada's Wonderland in the days of animal stunts and freak shows. Hanlan's Point had those and more, including a roller coaster and merry-go-round, a long boardwalk along the beach, a roller rink, and a dance hall. It was a place made for summer dreams. In 1897, an entertainment promoter called Lol Solomon bought the Toronto baseball team, then the Toronto Maple Leafs, and moved it to the Hanlan's Point Stadium. He also happened to manage the ferry service, and baseball games meant many fans needing a ride across the water. When the wooden stadium burned down in 1909, it was replaced by a concrete stadium holding 18,000 seats. It was there that baseball history was made. On September 5, 1914, 19-year-old Babe Ruth, playing for the minor league AAA team, the Providence Grays, hit a 3-run homer, the first home run of his legendary professional career. Local legend suggests that the ball is still somewhere out there at the bottom of the bay. Find it, and you'll be a lot richer. If you look a little further down the road to your right, you'll be able to see through the fence at the airport. To give you a sense of how much the landscape of this place has changed, just over the fence was the baseball stadium, Coliseum-like in its grand architecture. It was demolished in 1937 to make room for the airport. This airport, by the way, has been a major source of controversy since it opened, pitting those who favor the convenience of a downtown airport against those who believe the airport reduces the quality of life of the city and should be replaced by a park or other amenities. As we mentioned, the landform of the island has changed over the years. The original sand spit was a dynamic landform, formed by natural forces. On the south, that is the lakeside, currents deposited sand from the Scarborough Bluffs that added to the landform. On the north, that is the bay side, currents removed sand, yielding a changing mosaic of land, sandbars, and wetlands. But human impact has made a much bigger impression than Mother Nature in the last 200 years. And we'll note again and again in this tour, silt and sand dredged from the harbor has been dumped onto shorelines to improve boating conditions, to fight shoreline erosion, to create the land beneath the island airport, to create more dry land for cottaging and housing, and to create whole new islands. In fact, what you see around you today is really a human creation, something that would be entirely unrecognizable to Toronto's first Aboriginal peoples, who knew the peninsula in its natural state for millennia before Europeans arrived. Treed parks with trimmed green lawns have replaced the sandbars and wetlands of the old peninsula. The airport remains perhaps the best example of how human beings have altered the landscape to suit their needs. Many Torontonians may not realize that airplanes first flew from the island in 1915, when Canada's first air school was built during the First World War at Hanlan's Point. In 1929, City Council approved the building of a harbor for seaplanes, but it would not agree to fill in part of the harbor to create an airport. Then, in 1935, during the Great Depression, as part of a government stimulus plan, the federal government proposed to build a tunnel under the foot of Bathurst Street. After a lot of intense debate, City Council approved the plan to build the tunnel and an airport. Digging commenced, but a federal election changed the government, and the new government yanked the funding for the tunnel, and the hole already partly dug was filled in. Another example of how history repeats itself. At the time of writing this tour in the summer of 2009, a tunnel to the airport is again the topic of local heated discussion. By 1937, despite opposition from Hanlan's Point residents, the airport on the island was under construction. To make way for the airport, over 50 cottages and homes had to be moved out of the way. Many floated down to other parts of the island, including Sunfish Island, which was enlarged to become Algonquin Island. Lagoons were filled in to create landing strips, and the baseball stadium and much of the amusement park were demolished. The Hanlan's Memorial Regatta Course, homage to the Great Ned, was also filled in, and rowing races were moved to the present-day Long Pond. The airport was finally completed in 1939 and named Port George VI Airport, after the king, who was visiting at the time. It's hard to imagine today, but this tiny little airport originally served as the Toronto Airport, a 1930s version of Pearson International, when few had any clue of what air travel would become. Today, the airport still boasts its original terminal building, now of national historic importance and a rare survivor of early aviation history. Now pause the tour and turn around and go back past Ned's statue and turn right in the opposite direction of the ferry dock. A short way along, you'll find a blue and gold Provincial plaque telling the story of Gibraltar Point. Stop there and press play. This is stop 3, and you should now be in front of a blue and gold Provincial plaque commemorating Gibraltar Point. As this plaque notes, when Upper Canada's first Lieutenant Governor, John Graves Simcoe, moved the capital from Niagara-on-the-Lake to Toronto in 1793, the Toronto Island, then a peninsula, played an important part in his choice. The peninsula offered natural protection to the harbour and newly established town of York, sited just west of the Don River. Although the peninsula was flat and sandy, Simcoe felt that it could be fortified. This, rather than any resemblance to the rock in Spain, is probably why he chose to call it Gibraltar Point. A couple of military storehouses were built on the point a year or two after Simcoe arrived, and a blockhouse and guardhouse followed a few years later. These buildings are long gone, and in fact, somewhat confusingly, when people talk about Gibraltar Point today, they are referring to the area further along where the Lighthouse and Art Center still stands. Now it's time to pause the tour again and head along to our next stop, which is about a kilometer ahead. At the fork immediately ahead of you, keep going to the left. At the second fork, quite a bit further down the road, you're going to pull off to the grass on the right side of the road at the fork and start the tour up again. This is stop 4, and you should now be looking across the water at the boats and across Blockhouse Bay to the home of the Island Yacht Club, Muggs Island. There's a story behind this name. In the 1880s, 4 young men were camping there and crossing back to the mainland to work each day. One day, they retrieved a sign floating in the water. It turned out to be a cast-off sign from the Royal Theatre, advertising the play Muggs Landing. The men erected it at their campsite, and the name Muggs Island was born. The boats you're admiring likely belong to the Island Yacht Club, whose main building is behind the trees. The club is one of 3 yacht clubs on Toronto Island. It was begun in 1950 by Ben Dunkelman because the city's existing yacht clubs were closed to Jewish applicants at the time. Toronto, like the islands, has changed a great deal. Another place reflecting these changes is the clothing-optional beach, for which you'll see signs as we bike to our next stop. The beach is perhaps one of the few original stretches of shoreline left on the island today. Best of all, here you can sunbathe with as few clothes on as you like. This beach has always been a popular place to sunbathe nude, but legalized by City Council in 2002 after a somewhat controversial 3-year trial. Now we're going to the Gibraltar Point Lighthouse. Pause the tour and take the right-hand fork in the path. You'll know you're there when you see the Gibraltar Point Center for the Arts to your right and the lighthouse just set back from the road on your left. Did you find the lighthouse? This is stop 5 on the map, and no building on the island is as old or tells a better story of the changes Toronto and its islands have experienced in the last 200 years. To get a handle on some of those changes, you'll have to imagine yourself standing in the water right now. When the lighthouse was built in 1808, it was only about 6 meters from the shore and on a barren sand dune with no trees nearby to obstruct its light. Photographs in the late 19th century showed with the lighthouse keeper's cottage nearby, whitewashed to protect it against the weather. Both buildings looked like they could be on our Atlantic coast, not here in Toronto. Since the lighthouse was built, however, the shoreline has moved as sand and silt brought here by currents and storms accumulated. I'll say that again. The building is still on its original site. It's the shoreline that's moved. Today, the Island Lighthouse is the oldest on the Great Lakes, the second oldest in Canada, and a contestant for the oldest building still standing on its original foundations in Toronto. Better yet, the lighthouse takes us back to long-forgotten days when Toronto was a shipping town and Lake Ontario was its highway, the easiest way in and out. Its construction in 1808 to 1809 was a great step forward for the captains trying to guide their ships in storms and at night around the sand shoals of the Toronto Island. The building's importance was made clear by its cost. When nearly all other buildings in what was then a tiny town of York were made of wood, the lighthouse was made of limestone brought by ship from Queenston near Niagara Falls. It was made to survive the lake storms that smashed these shores. Its walls are 2 meters thick at the base. Originally 16 meters high, it was raised to 25 meters in 1832. At that height, it was the tallest building in the city for almost 50 years. The stories go on. During the American invasion and burning of York in April 1813, this lighthouse was one of the few public buildings along the shoreline that was spared from destruction. For many decades, the lighthouse was the first landmark seen by all boats approaching Toronto. In the early years, the wick lamps of the light were fueled with over 4,000 liters of sperm whale oil annually. Coal oil was used later, until electricity came in 1917. In 1945, the light was changed from white to green to distinguish it from the bright lights of the modern city. In 1957, after 150 years of service, the lighthouse was decommissioned. The replacement of shipping by air and rail has since kept it largely forgotten. That said, it remains cared for by an honorary lightkeeper and maintained by the city's parks staff. One final tale we can't ignore. Lighthouses always seem to have tales of lore attached to them, and this one's no different. The first lighthouse keeper, one J.B. Radelmuller, was murdered, supposedly by a couple of soldiers from nearby Fort York, although no one was ever convicted of the crime. Radelmuller may or may not have had a supply of bootleg beer, and he may or may not have been an illicit booze smuggler. But the story goes the soldiers wanted some booze, obtained some from Radelmuller, but not enough to slake their thirst, and perhaps killed him when he refused to give them more. His body was never found, and island legend has it that his ghost haunts the lighthouse still. It is island tradition that when children from the nearby school are given a tour of the lighthouse, that they are sat on the lighthouse steps and told this story, preferably in the dark, with only a candle to light the damp, cramped stone interior. We'll now briefly shift our gaze away from the lighthouse and to two other significant bits of history on this island point. Before Europeans arrived, the peninsula was known to First Nations as a spiritual place of peace and healing. It offered plenty of fish, plants, and wood, so they set up camp in the summer away from the swampy shores across the water. European settlers followed the First Nations people in thinking of the island as a place for healing. For example, as several cholera epidemics ravaged the town early in the 19th century, it was proposed to house the victims in the island to isolate them. And in 1883, a convalescent hospital, the Lakeside Home for Little Children, was opened just back along the road where we've come from, close to the site where the baseball diamond is now. Built by the Hospital for Sick Children and paid for by John Ross Robertson, publisher of the Telegram newspaper, the home was expanded in 1891 and then completely rebuilt after it was destroyed by fire in 1915. Used as a children's convalescent hospital until 1928, it was also used to billet the Royal Norwegian Air Force contingent who trained at the island airport during the Second World War. Toronto Island seems like a logical place for an artist's enclave, and sure enough, if you look across the path from the lighthouse towards the shore, you'll find the Gibraltar Point Centre for the Arts. This is the original location of the island school. While by 1888 the island community was largely a summer one with a few thousand residents, a handful of hardy souls remained year-round. Catherine Durnan, wife of the lighthouse keeper, had been teaching the island children during the winter since the early 1880s. Eventually, a one-room schoolhouse housing 17 pupils was built in 1888 on a barren, windswept location near the lighthouse. This building burned down in May 1909 and was rebuilt the same year slightly further west. It is the second building that formed the nucleus of the one you're looking at. The school thrived due to the growth of the island residential community, and additions were made each decade until 1953, when the school reached its peak enrollment of 587 students. Responsibility for the island was given to Metropolitan Toronto in 1956. One objective of Metro, as we heard earlier, was to convert all of the island land, except that occupied by the airport and a few private yacht clubs, to public green space. The school lost most of its students when the homes on nearby Hanlan's Point and later Centre Island were destroyed by Metro for parkland in the 1950s. During 1956, evictions and uncertainty drastically reduced the population of the island, and 10 of 17 classrooms were closed. The school principal during that period was a naturalist and wanted the building to be used as a natural science school. The Island Natural Science School was established in 1960 as a residential program for Toronto grade 6 students. It was the first natural science school in Canada and the second in North America. The school then had two roles. It was the public school for island children and ran a residential science program for mainland kids. Once the new school building, which we'll see in a few minutes, was put up in 1997, Artscape was asked to step in, and they did, creating an arts complex for living, working, creating, and thinking. The center has a number of programs, all designed to provide space and time for artists. Now pause the tour again, and continue along the road a short distance until you get to the island filtration plant on your left. We'll stop outside the main gate. This is stop 6, and to your left should be the island filtration plant. This facility marks the beginning of modern water treatment in Toronto. Becoming modern meant creating an ample, reliable supply of pure drinking water that would protect public health and ensure the city's prosperity. As Toronto's oldest water treatment facility dating back to 1911, the island plant was recognized in 1981 as a water landmark by the American Waterworks Association. Part of the plant was listed on the City of Toronto's inventory of heritage properties in 1974. In the early days of York, citizens relied on streams, private wells, and water carters for their water supply. As Toronto grew, priority was placed on obtaining a source of water for firefighting. City Council decided that this could best be obtained through a private contract good for 50 years. By 1843, Toronto's first waterworks system consisted of a pumping station at the foot of Peter Street, which supplied harbor water through logs with a hole bored through the center. Unfortunately, because the city had built a major sewer outfall a few feet from the water intake pipe, complaints about the quality and quantity of this water were to persist for nearly 3 decades. City Council finally purchased the pumping station in 1872 and set out to build a new water supply system. The raw water intake pipe was moved from the polluted harbor to the southern lake side of Toronto Island, where the beach sands were transformed into a gigantic natural filter. Lake water trickled through a set of basins into a wooden conduit, where it traveled under Blockhouse Bay before joining an iron pipe near the western channel. The pipe then sent filtered water to a new pumping station at the foot of John Street and onto the city's distribution and storage network. All this seemed to produce little improvement in water quality. In 1882, the Globe described Toronto's water as drinkable sewage. That same year, with the island filter basins becoming weedy and putrid, the city moved the intake pipe about half a mile or almost a kilometer out into Lake Ontario and abandoned the infiltration basins. But problems remained. After a storm in 1886, one Torontonian reported mud and a sort of seahorse with antlers and numerous legs in his drinking glass. A series of typhoid epidemics made the connection between water purity, waste disposal, and human disease clearer in the 1890s when a wooden conduit in Blockhouse Bay ruptured twice, allowing foul harbor water to enter the system. Toronto finally began work on a new water supply system in 1908, building a 1,500-meter tunnel under the harbor and a larger, longer intake pipe. The above-ground jewel was the Island Filtration Plant, completed in 1911 and originally producing over 200 million liters of pure water a day. That's 10 times the volume of the infiltration basins. Designed by U.S. engineer Allen Hazen in a restrained neoclassical style, the buildings were unified by the use of round arched windows, many of which are now partially or fully blocked up, yellow brick, and double-hipped pan-tile roofs. During construction, in 1910, yet another break in the Toronto Harbor conduit caused Toronto's last typhoid epidemic, inspiring North America's first large-scale use of chlorine to kill waterborne pathogens. In 1911, the new intake pipe broke south of the island, forcing Toronto to rely on polluted, but now highly chlorinated harbor water. Then, a mere 6 months after the plant was commissioned, demand exceeded supply, and a mixture of filtered and untreated water was pumped into the distribution system. The ensuing scandal shook up the management of public works in Toronto. City engineer C.H. Rust resigned, and R.C. Harris was appointed Commissioner of Works in 1912. In his unprecedented 33-year reign, Harris oversaw the expansion of the island plant in 1914 to 1917, adding 280 million liters of daily capacity, and the complete duplication of Toronto's water supply system. The latter project, intended to meet growing demand and eliminate the prospect of catastrophic system failure, included the new 440 million-liter filtration plant at Victoria Park that now carries Harris's name. The impact on public health was more immediate. Toronto's typhoid rate, 44 deaths per 100,000 people in 1910, has been negligible ever since. The once pivotal role of the island plant in Toronto's water supply system declined once additional water treatment plants were built in Scarborough and Etobicoke from the late 1950s to the early 1970s. A new island facility, now with a capacity of 400 million litres per day, was completed in 1977 in the brutalist style, and all of the early works were abandoned. The original island plant changed to a May to October operation, used to meet peak demand during hot weather and to act as a backup when another water treatment plant was taken out of service for maintenance. The island plant gained a new, enhanced year-round function in 2004 thanks to the Deep Water Cooling Project. In this partnership between the City of Toronto and Enwave Energy Corporation, the energy in cold water is used to air-condition high-rise buildings in downtown Toronto. 3 intake pipes draw 4 degrees Celsius water from 5 kilometers offshore at a depth of 83 meters. Heat exchangers at the John Street pumping station transfer energy between the icy cold lake water and Enwave's closed chilled water supply loop. The water drawn from the lake continues on its regular route through the pumping station for distribution through the city's water supply system. Enwave uses only the coldness from the lake water, not the actual water, to provide a green alternative to conventional air conditioning. At Toronto Island, this meant a complete modernization and automation of the filtration plant. South of the filtration plant, you can see a striking willow fence that anchors an amazing restoration project. To build the new intake for deep lake water cooling, the original vegetation here was completely stripped away. City Parks, in partnership with the Toronto Bay Initiative, planted thousands of trees, shrubs, and wildflowers here, and this has led to a rebuilding of the sand dunes. One of the island's 3 blue flag beaches lies on the other side of the vegetation. Leaving the filtration plant, we're going to stay on this road, which bears left around the plant, and stop at the Island Public Natural Science School, which will be to your right. As usual, pause the tour and start again when you get to the school. This is Stop 7, and you should now be standing in front of the Island School. As we heard a couple of stops ago, the Island Public and Natural Science School has for several decades now been 2 schools in one. There's a regular program that services the island and the Toronto harborfront children, and a residential science program for 68 students in grades 5 and 6. Students attending the science program are from city schools and spend several days at the island school living in dorms and studying natural science and outdoor education. It's a great experience, and for some of them, it's their only chance to be in such a natural environment. The day students, a mixture of kids from the island and the city, in junior kindergarten through grade 6, are transported to the school by the ferry and school bus. The school focuses on music, drama, French, and new media, but the core focus is environmentalism. It truly is a green school. The building is a state-of-the-art facility with science labs and a greenhouse, a gray water recycling system, solar panels, and photovoltaic panels. Beyond the school, you can see the Franklin Children's Garden, which includes artificial ponds for turtles and amphibians, and an active program for storytelling. Now we're going to continue on to Center Island. You follow this road and turn right just past the school. You'll be following along the shore of the lagoon, a regatta course actually, and eventually reach a large plaza with flower beds and a large fountain in the center. You'll also see a bridge crossing the lagoon to the left, which crosses over to Centerville, the island amusement park. Now pause the tour and turn it back on when you get there. You're now at Stop 8 and should be looking towards the fountain, part of the avenue of the islands laid out in 1961. Find a seat by the flower beds and we'll tell you a little bit about Center Island. During the 1880s, the city transformed Center Island from a not very promising stretch of sand, marsh, and water into a large park and recreation ground through filling, dredging, elevating, and planting. By the time the island park was officially opened in 1888, it had become a complete village with about 1,000 summer cottagers and tenters in both Hanlan's Point and Center Island. St. Andrew's by the Lake Church opened at what would become the corner of Cherokee and Lakeshore Avenues, readily accessible to both Center Island and Hanlan's Point residents. We'll see the church in a few minutes at its present location. By 1900, the summer population was about 3,000 and included many prominent municipal politicians, surveyor-cartographer Charles E. Goad, Arthur L. Massey, architect of Old City Hall E.J. Lennox, stationery magnate Samuel M. Toy of Grandin Toy fame, and financier Emilius Jarvis. Amusements such as a merry-go-round, a Ferris wheel, boat rentals, refreshment pavilion, and a bandstand increased the summer popularity of Center Island. In the early 1900s, the Center Island community grew by leaps and bounds, with new streets added and 50 more cottages built between 1904 and 1914. The stretch from the bridge down to the lakeshore, where the carefully cultivated flower bed gardens are now, was called Manitou Road. It was known as the business street of Center Island, or more commonly, the main drag. Here one could find a grocery store, an ice cream parlor, a meat market, laundry, restaurant, and a dairy. English's Boathouse, just on the east side of the bridge close to where the current canoe rental facilities are, and Pearson's Hotel, at the lakeshore end around the corner from Manitou Road. Residents could count on twice-a-day mail delivery, gas, and later electricity and telephones, and fresh food from a variety of stores. In the future came delivery services from Eaton's and Simpson's, the department stores of the day, for supplies, pharmaceutical deliveries, a branch of the Dominion Bank, and even more shops, laundries, and dining options, leaving little reason for islanders to go to the city, except, of course, to go to work. The islands continue to be a place of recreation, and over the bridge to your left is Centerville, created in 1967 when money flowed from Canada's centennial year and as part of the Metro government's campaign to transform the mixed residential and recreational island into pure park land. Bit by bit, houses and cottages and shops were torn down, a whole community, and in their place came 240 hectares of parkland and over 30 rides and attractions, including a log flume ride and a sky ride. Far Enough Farm is at the far end of Center Island. You'll be able to get a better view of that when we move on to Algonquin and Ward's Island. And over on the other side of the flower beds and plaza is the amazing hedge maze, built in 1967 as a centennial gift from Toronto's Dutch-Canadian community. Our next stop is going to be at the end of the pier. To get there, once you pause the tour, you will go to your right and ride straight down the center avenue, past the pools and flower beds, past the bike rentals and on to the end of the pier. Then, turn the tour on again. You're now at stop 9, and at the end of the pier which juts straight out from Manitou Beach into Lake Ontario. Its sense of vulnerability, stretched so far out over the water beyond the safety of the shore, gives us a chance to step back and consider the story of the islands as it relates to the 14th largest lake in the world, Lake Ontario. You've likely chosen to be here on a pleasant day. Pick a stormy day, when high winds whip the water into thrashing waves, and you'll understand why the walls of Gibraltar Point Lighthouse are 2 meters thick, why this pier is made up of concrete, and why a long engineered break wall protects the beach here from the power of the tumultuous lake. The lake has made these islands, bringing sand from the Scarborough Bluffs to fortify its shores. But the lake has also unmade these islands. The waves of the lake have worked away at eroding these shores, with the sand dunes and sand bars shifting according to currents and storms. But when people build roads and cottages and parks on those dunes and sandbars, that erosion is no longer welcome. Concrete is often the cure. Note the long wall securing the shoreline as it runs east from here to Wards. The lake has not only made and unmade the island, it has made and unmade the people who use the lake's surfaces as their sometimes unpredictable highway. From the vantage point on this pier, you can put yourselves on ship decks with those who, well past the beginning of railways in Toronto in the 1850s, relied on boats and ferries to get from Toronto to Montreal, or Toronto to Niagara, or Toronto to New York. Their view is around you. As big as Lake Ontario is, you might be able to look out across the water to make out the opposite shore. Back towards the island, in spite of the landfill and concrete, you can still imagine the first glimpse of Toronto that many 19th century immigrants saw. A low-lying bit of land ringed by sand with trees that, from farther away, looked as if they were growing out of the water. Past us, and around the bend of the island, Aboriginal peoples paddled canoes to the Humber, Don or Rouge River sheds, and from there to the upper Great Lakes. The early European traders who followed the Aboriginal routes paddled and sailed right past this only 400 years ago. The eyes of Lieutenant Governor and Elizabeth Simcoe eagerly followed this shoreline, as did the eyes of American soldiers, nervously awaiting the order to disembark for shore on the morning of the April 1813 attack on Toronto during the War of 1812. One of them painted a picture of the island and its new lighthouse. Past us sailed immigrants after the seaways were reopened at the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812, including the desperate and sick famine refugees from Ireland, their hungry eyes scouring the shoreline for hope. From here, with the constants of the water and the shore around us, we can also imagine the terror of those caught in storms, the thrashing waves driving them closer to the shallow waters off the shore of the island until their hulls were ground to a jarring halt. In the 19th century, the shoreline before us saw its fair share of shipwrecks, the not-so-subtle reason why the lighthouse was built in the first place. Even with the lighthouse warning boats away from the shore, the yacht Toronto was wrecked on this shore in 1811, when the skipper got confused about the position of the light. In the early winter of 1859, the brand-new steamer the Monarch was rammed by waves into the shore, with its crew barely escaping with their lives. For years, the wrecked hull was a landmark along this shore for islanders. That more lives were not lost in these wrecks was due to the amazing courage and strength of the islanders, who jumped into rowboats to help the stranded crews. Of these islanders, William Ward of the island's famous family was no doubt the most renowned. Clearly traumatized by the loss of 5 of his sisters, in spite of his desperate efforts to save them, in a tragic 1862 boating accident in the bay, Ward later told reporters that, "Ever since, I've tried to help those in distress." His and others' efforts to save the crew of the schooner Jane Ann Marsh in 1868 is a case in point. The schooner ran aground just east of here in a violent snowstorm and was not noticed until bits of its wreckage were found on shore the next day, and the ship was spied through the driving snow. Strong and determined, William Ward and another, Robert Barry, stripped to their underwear in the icy cold and launched a rowboat into the violent water, others wading in to help them get free of the shore. It's hard to imagine the fight against the elements that followed. The rowboat flipped several times, with Ward and Barry dragged back to the shore by their friends before they successfully made it to the boat. Clinging to the masts and held there by ice, the crew was freed by Ward and Barry, who smashed the ice with sticks. The half-frozen and nearly helpless men were hauled into the rowboat, which was almost always at risk of capsizing as it bounded off the ship's hull. The men were then rowed ashore. 7 trips were needed. Between each, Ward and Barry ran around on shore to restore their circulation. In 1880, Ward would be named the captain of the now official island life-saving crew. 25 years later, he was still leading the charge into boats and through violent storms to save lives. Driven by the memory of his drowned sisters, he would save 164 lives in his astounding career. With gratitude to Ward and the island's other members of life-saving crews, put the lake now behind you and head back to shore. You're now going to ride your bike back almost to where you came from, past the bike rentals, through the plaza, past the maze, and then turn right onto a small path, immediately after the maze. You'll pass in front of the maze's entrance, then ride past the boat rental, and along the lagoon's edge until you reach St. Andrew's by the Lake Church. Now pause the tour until you get there. You're now at Stop 10, standing in front of St. Andrew's Church. Isn't this a beautiful setting? As we've mentioned earlier, this isn't the church's first location. In 1884, it was built about halfway between the First Island School, now Artscape, and Manitou Road, now the Pier, at the cost of $2,000. It was moved here in 1959, when the building was literally sawn into 2 pieces and relocated. It took 2 years, great care and great skill, but the building was saved. That kind of effort says something about how much this little building was treasured. The church contains some of the fittings, including the Stations of the Cross, from St. Rita's Catholic Church, which was situated about 100 meters south and was demolished during the 1970s. Although it is supported by the Anglican Church, St. Andrew's is now multi-denominational. This building, more than many others, has been an important part of the lives of Toronto's once rich and famous citizens. Toronto's leading families had cottages here, of course, and a number of them helped to make this building what it is today. The Most Reverend Arthur Sweatman, who later became Bishop of Toronto, Archbishop of Toronto, and Primate of all Canada, was the guiding force behind its construction. He had his cottage built on Lakeshore Avenue, just west of the church. The Masseys and the Gooderhams helped too. Family histories here were, and still are, woven together in marriages in this building. Today, the building serves the island community as an important site for church services, christenings, marriage, and music recitals, and the building has since been designated by the city as a heritage building. This little church's magnificent stained glass windows were added to the church after the First World War, from 1919 to 1921. These windows were designed and built by the famous craftsman Robert McCausland, and since 1950, the annual Blessing of the Boats has been held in this lagoon behind the church. Boats of all sizes and shapes, mostly from the Royal Canadian Yacht and the Queen City Yacht Clubs, come here to have their boats be blessed by the St. Andrew by the Lake Rector. Now pause the tour once more and bike a little further down the road and turn left over the first bridge over the lagoon that you come to. Turn the tour back on when you get to the entrance at the Royal Canadian Yacht Club. Unfortunately, you won't be able to get past the gate unless you're a member or a guest. This is stop 11, and you should be standing outside the gates of the Royal Canadian Yacht Club. This is the granddaddy of yacht clubs. It was founded in 1852 as the Toronto Boat Club, a recreational club and unofficial auxiliary of the Royal Navy on Lake Ontario. In 1854, the Mainland Club successfully petitioned Queen Victoria for the right to call itself Royal. Since it was the first yacht club in Canada to apply for the royal designation, it became the Royal Canadian Yacht Club. In 1881, it moved from the Toronto waterfront to the Toronto Island after building a clubhouse here on reclaimed marshland. The original island clubhouse, which you can see from the picture on your screen, was burned down in 1904, and the subsequent building also burned down a few years later in 1918. The current clubhouse was built in 1919 in the same neoclassical Edwardian style as its predecessor. You can't see it from here, so we've included a couple of pictures. The building has been designated by the city as a heritage building. Many of Canada's best Olympic and international sailors have come from the RCYC, and its junior sailing program continues to train young sailors, beginning at age 7. Our next stop will be the Island Firehouse. Pause the tour now and cross back over the bridge and go left along the path. Stay on the path and watch out for flying discs from the Frisbee golf course. Disc golfers take this very seriously. The Disc Golf Canadian Open has been held on this course before, and this Toronto Island course is sort of the Augusta National for the Frisbee golf set. And it's been around for nearly 30 years, almost as long as the game itself. This is stop 12, and you should now be standing in front of the new Island Fire Station, which is on the right-hand side of the road. In 1960, the station of the day was floated from Manitou Avenue on Centre Island as part of the removal of housing on the island. It was relocated a little further down the road and is now the home of the Island Canoe Club. The station that you see in front of you was built in 1995, and the very unusual clock that you see overhead was designed by artist Gord Peterin. Over the island's history, fire was a major threat. Many island landmarks were destroyed by fire. The stadium in 1903, the Royal Canadian Yacht Club in 1904, and again in 1918. The Hanlan's Point Amusement Park and Hanlan's Hotel in 1909. The level of fire protection was often criticized, particularly the water pressure available to firefighters. By January 1925, 2 firemen had been placed on the island for the winter and a new pump engine provided, and the next year improvements to the fire hall were made. Despite these improvements, in January 1939, the Island Amateur Aquatic Association clubhouse went up in flames. Sadly, a number of the old frame houses at Wards and Algonquin Islands were lost over the years due to fire. Today, fire service is as good as on the mainland. Now pause the tour and continue on this path until you get to a bridge on your left-hand side which leads to Algonquin Island. Dismount, walk over the bridge, and turn the tour back on the other side. You're now at stop 13 and standing on the Algonquin Island side of the bridge. Originally called Sunfish Island and created by sand pumps and infill from what was marshland. Algonquin Island covers about 18 hectares and was developed with proper lots and summer cottages in mind to create revenue for the city in rents and taxes. Planned in the early 1900s, it took many years, including the interruption of the First World War, for Sunfish Island to be completed. Even then, it remained primitive and uninhabited except for a YMCA summer camp for boys that began in 1919. The Queen City Yacht Club relocated here in 1921 after its main landside clubhouse collapsed into the water because of construction work being carried out by the Harbor Commission. The decision to construct the island airport in 1937 resulted in many cottages on Hanlan's Point being floated on barges to the still largely uninhabited Sunfish Island, which was soon renamed Algonquin Island. The Algonquin Island community began in earnest in 1938, when the first 30 cottages were moved here from the Hanlan's Point end. Barren and sandy with no gas, no electricity, and no deliveries yet, it was the start of a new community. Throughout the 1940s, more cottages were constructed, and after World War II, when Toronto had a housing shortage, returning vets were encouraged by the city to build year-round homes on the island. By 1951, all Algonquin lots had been built on, resulting in a substantial year-round community, in addition to summer residents. An Algonquin Island Association and Clubhouse was also built. We encourage you now to pause the tour, explore Algonquin Island at your own speed, and get a feel of the houses here, each so different in its design. If you go down to the shore, out to the right, on the small peninsula, is the Queen City Yacht Club, which was established at the foot of Bathurst Street in 1889, making it one of Toronto's oldest sailing clubs. The boats are moored in a sheltered lagoon here, and the view from the 1920s clubhouse is one of the most gorgeous views of Toronto to be seen anywhere. On the other end of the island, if you take the path to the left, you'll see the Algonquin Island Association Clubhouse. When you're ready, go back over the bridge again, pick up the path to the left, and stop at the Rectory Cafe, which will be immediately to your right, and turn back on when you get there. You are now at stop 14 and standing at the drive of the Rectory Cafe. As has been mentioned earlier in the tour, before the Second World War, there were 750 homes and cottages on the island extending from Hanlan's Point to Wards. We heard from Matthew and Allison about the battle to save the island homes at the beginning of the tour. Just to remind you, in 1955, Metro Toronto decided to take over the island to create a park, which was later interpreted as needing to demolish all houses, stores, hotels, and other island community buildings. And in 1956, the homes started to come down, starting at Hanlan's and proceeding east. By 1968, when the bulldozers were stopped at the edge of Wards Island, over 450 buildings had been torn down. Here, where Shaw House and the Rectory Cafe still stand, is where the destruction ended. No more houses beyond this were demolished. As Matthew and Allison told you, the story didn't finish there. The Metro government continued to try to remove the remaining housing from the island until, in 1993, an arrangement was reached where a land trust was created, allowing residents to stay, to improve the houses, and to sell houses, with the land itself belonging to the trust. A list of potential purchasers is kept by the trust. Names are added by lottery, and when a home comes up for sale, it is offered to the names on the list in rank order. Prices are based on a regulated price for the land lease and on the cost of construction of the house itself. The intent is that no one can make windfall profits from selling island homes. For more details, you can look at the Toronto Island Community website. For many years after the demolitions, the rectory continued to house the priest from St. Andrew by the Lake, hence the name Rectory. It now holds the Rectory Cafe and Island Art Gallery that features the work of the island's many artists. The Shaw House next door was spared as a residence for the park's superintendent and his family. Through the concerted actions of the island community, it is now a home for seniors and contains a number of green innovations, such as a straw bale wall and a green roof. Our next stop is the Wards Island Clubhouse. Pause the tour and keep riding down the road until you reach the Wards Island ferry dock on your left, and on your right there's a path that will take you to the clubhouse, a largish blue building. Turn on again when you get to the clubhouse. You're now at stop 15. You should be standing in front of a blue building, which has a coffee and snack bar along the front. Wards Island is named after the Ward family, longtime residents of the island, and William Ward in particular, who was a fisherman, an island constable, and renowned captain of the island lifeboat station. The first construction on the eastern end of the island, aside from temporary fishermen shanties, was Michael O'Connor's 1833 hotel, The Retreat on the Peninsula, which had a short life. Then, about a decade later, Louis Prevat opened another hotel on the site, named the Peninsula Hotel, because the island was then still a peninsula connected to the mainland across what is now the Eastern Gap. Primarily a summer resort, the hotel grounds boasted the island's first amusement park, a bowling alley, and a small zoo. Patrons were ferried across the harbor on a boat powered by 5 horses walking in a circular treadmill, which turned paddle wheels on each side. By 1880, the hotel was gone, and the eastern end of the island was little more than a deserted, windswept expanse of bulrushes, ponds, and sandbanks. The Wyman Baths arrived in 1882, with its bathing grounds facing the city, an impressive 2-story structure housing a large parlor, 6 small rooms, a meeting area, and changing rooms. The Wyman Baths were a huge success and led to improvements on this side of the island in the 1880s and 1890s, including the planting of trees, laying down of sidewalks, and filling in of stagnant ponds. William Ward went on to build Ward's Hotel near the baths, a ballroom where dances were held nightly through the summer, and a small shooting gallery for the additional entertainment of guests. Around the turn of the century, the Wyman Baths were converted into apartments. Originally, Ward's was a tent community. People rented a lot, built a platform on it, and pitched their tents there in the summertime. Over the years, many islanders added wooden structures on the front, such as a porch and a cookhouse at the back, and eventually, the tent was replaced by a structure. You can still see the pattern of this in some of the older houses. Until the 1930s, Ward's Islanders lived under canvas along well-defined streets from Victoria Day to Labor Day. The tents were transformed into summer cottages, and the summer cottages into the year-round homes that form today's community. 2 buildings that trace the transition from tent sites to cottages are the large Ward's Island Association Clubhouse in front of you, and the similar administration building behind it and beside the lawn bowling green. In 1910, Ward's Island attracted summer holiday makers looking for an inexpensive vacation. By 1913, the city and Ward's Island campers, upset at rowdy, unsanctioned dances, banded together to do something about it. The island campers formed the Ward's Island Association, or WIA. The dances were brought under control, and WIA became the social and organizational heart of the community, and in 1920 built the small administration building for its office. By 1931, the WIA convinced the city to allow Ward's Island campers to replace their tents with cottages, and by 1938, a permanent WIA clubhouse, where meetings, dances, and other entertainments could take place, was open. Algonquin and Ward's Island are the only part of the island left where people still live on a year-round basis. You heard their story at the beginning from Matthew and Allison. If you have time, we suggest that you explore this part of the island at your own pace. As on Algonquin, the houses are unique, and it's worth spending some time just wandering around. We're almost at the end of the tour. Ward's Island ferries return to the mainland hourly during the summer, so if you're going to look around Ward's community for a while, we suggest that you check out the ferry schedule first, just over the road at the dock, to see when you should get back to catch the ferry. When you're ready to leave, bike over to the dock and press play for our last story. You're now in the dock looking out at the water. If you look to the east, to your right, you'll get a sense of where the island used to be connected to the mainland. In those early days, when it was a peninsula, you could walk or travel by horseback from the town. The challenge, however, was crossing the Don River, which flooded in the spring. Around 1806, the first of a succession of bridges across the Don was built to allow residents access to the peninsula. As campgrounds, hotels, sport, and entertainment venues appeared on the island, it became a must to be able to ferry the clients across quickly and efficiently. Soon, small steamers would compete to take the day trippers across, leaving from wharfs at the foot of Bathurst, Dufferin, Yonge, and other streets. By 1890, the Toronto Ferry Company was in business and soon launched splendid double-decker ferries, such as the Mayflower, the Primrose, and the Trillium. Today, the ferry service is operated by the Parks Department out of a terminal that opened in 1972. We hope you've enjoyed your tour and that we've inspired you to come back and explore on your own. Many Heritage Toronto volunteers and staff contributed to the creation of the iTour. You'll find their names on our website. But we couldn't have done it without Sally Gibson's definitive book on the island, More Than an Island, which was the source of a lot of information on island history. We also want to thank Alison Zowski and Matthew Ferguson, who you heard at the beginning of the tour. The tour was produced by Popstream Digital for Heritage Toronto and was financially supported by the RBC Foundation. Please visit our website for more information on Heritage Toronto.